Okay, so get this. We're diving deep into evolution today.
Deep dive it is.
And you know what's wild?
What's that?
You've given us all this material on Darwin, natural selection, the whole evolutionary shebang.
It's quite the story, isn't it?
It really is. And our mission, should we choose to accept it, is not just to explain evolution, but to help you actually get it. Like why it matters to every living thing that's ever existed.
Because it's not just about knowing what evolution is. It's about understanding how it connects to everything around us, even us.
Exactly. It's about seeing those connections everywhere. So where do we even start with something this massive?
Well, Darwin's journey on the HMS Beagle is a good place to start, especially his time in the Galapagos.
Yeah, those Galapagos Islands were like a giant light bulb moment for him, weren't they?
They really were. I mean, here's Darwin just observing the natural world, and bam, a revolution in thought is born.
Right. And to think, our sources say he was born in 1809,
Right.
became this naturalist, geologist, the whole deal. But it was those observations, those Galapagos finches, that really got his gears turning.
They were like puzzle pieces clicking into place. He saw how organisms produce way more offspring than can actually survive, meaning competition is practically built into the system.
It's like nature sets the stage for a showdown right from the start.
Exactly. But then there's a twist. The individuals within those species, they're not identical clones. There's variation, these little differences that make each one unique.
And that right there, that's the key, isn't it?
It is. Because Darwin realized those variations. They're passed down from parents to offspring. It's all about lineage. So the lucky individuals that have traits that give them an advantage.
They're the ones surviving, reproducing, and passing on those winning genes.
Bingo. That, my friend, is natural selection in a nutshell.
Nature's way of saying, you've got the right stuff, you get to play the game.
It's like a constant editing process, favoring the traits that make organisms best suited to their environment. Over time, those tiny advantages, they add up, leading to some pretty big changes. That's adaptation in action.
And sometimes,
Sometimes.
bam, you get whole new species. Speaking of which, our sources talk about those peppered moths in England.
Classic example, right? When pollution darkened the trees, guess which moths were suddenly thriving? The darker ones.
It's like evolution was showing off right there for everyone to see. Camouflage for the win.
Exactly. And we can't forget about those Galapagos finches, the poster children for this whole idea.
Oh yeah, Darwin was fascinated by those finches, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He saw all these different beak shapes on different islands,
Yeah.
each beak perfectly matched to the type of food available there.
It's like each finch species found its own niche.
They did. And it turns out they all came from one ancestral species that landed on those islands and diversified like crazy. Adaptive radiation evolution in overdrive.
It's like that ancestor finch took one look at all those different food sources and said, all right, team, time to diversify the menu.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole process, it's not just happening with moths and finches.
Oh, definitely not. Think about antibiotic resistance in bacteria, or those superweeds that shrug off our best herbicides.
It's evolution happening right under our noses, and it has huge implications, especially for us.
Which, speaking of us, brings up a really interesting point. We've been talking about natural selection, but haven't we become pretty major players in this whole game ourselves?
We have. Think about it. Artificial selection, that's us stepping in and steering evolution in certain directions.
Right. We've been doing it for centuries, haven't we?
Yeah.
I mean, think about all the different dog breeds we have, the juicy tomatoes at the grocery store.
Right.
We've been playing evolutionary matchmaker for a long time.
And that just shows the power of selection, how choosing certain traits can drastically change a species over time.
It makes you wonder how much we've influenced the tree of life without even realizing it.
Food for thought, for sure.
Okay, so we've got these evolutionary forces shaping life, but it's not always a simple survival of the fittest situation.
Yeah.
It's more complex than that, right?
You're absolutely right. Evolution doesn't always follow a straight line. Our sources talk about different types of selection, like directional selection, where one extreme trait gets favored.
Like those darker moths. The whole population shifted toward that one extreme.
Exactly. But then you've got sexual selection, and this is where things get really interesting. It's not about surviving predators, it's about attracting a mate.
Right, because if you can't find a mate, your genes aren't going anywhere.
Exactly. And that leads to some pretty wild adaptations, like those peacocks with their extravagant tails.
Those tails are gorgeous, but they don't exactly scream blending in.
They don't. A peacock's tail is basically a billboard that screams, "Look at me, I'm healthy, I'm strong, I've got good genes."
And the peahens are totally buying it. It's risky, but it works. So we've got these evolutionary forces shaking life, but what about the results?
You mean the remarkable adaptations that make organisms fit their environments like a glove?
Yeah, those adaptations are amazing. A chameleon changing its color to blend in, a giraffe's long neck reaching for those high leaves.
Yeah,
They're like tools honed by evolution over generations.
exactly. They're the tools of the trade. And they can be physical, like the examples you just mentioned, but they can also be behavioral.
Behavioral.
Yeah, think about bird migration or how squirrels bury nuts for the winter. Those are adaptations too. And let's not forget about physiological adaptations, like producing venom or being able to digest tough plant matter.
It's like nature looked at every environment and said, challenge accepted. And speaking of challenges, how do we go from these tiny adaptations to brand new species? That's where speciation comes in, right?
Exactly. Our sources describe allopatric speciation, where a population gets split up, maybe by a mountain range or a large body of water. Since they can't interbreed, they evolve independently.
Like those finches on different islands.
Yeah.
Isolated, but eventually evolving into entirely different species. So isolation leads to, well, new species.
That's one way it happens. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Sympatric speciation. New species popping up without any physical barriers.
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
It's like they're evolving in the same place, but different languages develop within the population. Maybe their mating rituals change or their breeding seasons no longer line up.
So they're living in the same area, but they're no longer mingling, genetically speaking.
Exactly. And over time, those differences become so significant that they're reproductively isolated, even though they're right next to each other. New species, same neighborhood.
Evolution is sneakier than I thought. But it's not always about gradual change, is it? Didn't our sources mention something about adaptive radiation, where evolution seems to go into hyperdrive?
They did. It's like an explosion of diversity.
Yeah.
One ancestral species branches out rapidly, filling all sorts of ecological niches.
The Galapagos finch is another example. All those different beaks adapted to different food sources on those islands.
Perfect example. It's like evolution throws a handful of darts at a dartboard, and suddenly, bam, new species are everywhere.
Talk about a grand entrance.
Yeah.
But hold on. It's not always about natural selection, is it? I think our sources mentioned something called genetic drift. Doesn't chance play a role, too?
It does. Imagine a wildfire rips through a forest and only a handful of lucky rabbits survive. That's the bottleneck effect. The surviving population might have a very different gene pool than the original one, just by pure chance.
So a random event can suddenly reshape the gene pool. That's wild.
It is. Or imagine a few birds get blown off course during a storm and end up on a remote island. They start a new population with a limited set of genes. That's the founder effect.
So they're starting fresh with whatever genes they happen to have brought with them.
Exactly. And that can lead to some unique evolutionary paths.
It's almost like evolution has a random side, which is both fascinating and a little unnerving. So sometimes evolution is about who wins the survival lottery.
Sometimes it is. But hey, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? This whole process is so complex and full of surprises, and those surprises have led to the incredible diversity of life we see on Earth today.
Speaking of which, we've been talking a lot about how evolution works, but what about the evidence? How do we know this isn't just a made-up story?
That's where things get really interesting, because we've actually got a mountain of evidence from all sorts of fields that points to the same conclusion: evolution is the real deal.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for starters, there's the fossil record. It's like a timeline of life on Earth, etched in stone.
It's like flipping through the family photo album of life on Earth.
Exactly. We can actually see how creatures have changed over millions of years and find those missing links that connect different groups.
Talk about ancient history. What other clues do we have?
Comparative anatomy is another big one. Have you ever noticed how the bones in a human arm, a bat's wing, and a whale's flipper are all surprisingly similar?
Now that you mention it, they do kind of look alike, just arranged differently.
Exactly. They all evolved from a common ancestor that had the same basic bone structure. It's like seeing the same blueprint modified for different purposes.
So we're all connected, bone by bone.
You got it. And then you've got those quirky little things called vestigial structures. They're like leftover parts, remnants of features that were useful to our ancestors but are now basically useless.
Like the appendix in humans. I've always wondered what that thing actually does.
Well, not much. It hints at our plant-eating ancestors. And you know what's even wilder? Whales have tiny pelvic bones.
Pelvic bones.
Mm.
But whales don't even have legs.
Exactly. Those bones are leftovers from their land-dwelling past. It's like they're carrying around a souvenir from their evolutionary history.
So we're like walking or swimming museums of our evolutionary past.
We are, and these vestigial structures, they're like whispers from the past telling us about the evolutionary journeys of different species.
This is incredible. It's like we've been piecing together this massive puzzle, and all the evidence, from fossils to anatomy, points to evolution as the answer.
It does, doesn't it? And it gets even better. We haven't even talked about molecular biology. This field has really blown this whole thing wide open.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. Tell me more.
By comparing DNA and protein sequences, we can track evolutionary relationships with incredible accuracy. It's like having the ultimate family tree.
So DNA is the ultimate ancestry test. What's it telling us?
It's confirming what we see in the fossil record and anatomy. The closer two species are related, the more similar their DNA.
It's amazing how all these different lines of evidence, from fossils to anatomy to the tiniest molecules, all point to the same conclusion.
They do. It really shows the power of the scientific method, doesn't it? Multiple lines of evidence converging on the same answer. Evolution is the driving force behind all this diversity of life on Earth.
It really makes you appreciate the interconnectedness of it all.
It does. And speaking of interconnectedness, have you ever heard of biogeography?
Biogeography.
It's the study of how species are spread across the globe.
So, like, why we find certain plants and animals in some places but not others?
Exactly. And it turns out the distribution of species reflects their evolutionary history, including patterns of migration, isolation, and common ancestry.
So it's like piecing together the historical movements of life on Earth.
Exactly. It's like a giant game of connect the dots.
I love connected dots.
This one's a bit more complex, but just as fascinating. For example, you often find closely related species living in areas that are separated by vast distances today.
Like on different continents.
Exactly. And that suggests they shared a common ancestor in that region before those continents drifted apart.
So it's like finding pieces of the same puzzle scattered across the globe.
Exactly. And then you have endemic species, those found in only one specific location, like an island.
Didn't we talk about something like that with the Galapagos finches?
We did.
Right.
Those finches are endemic to those islands. Each species evolved in isolation, perfectly adapted to its little corner of the world.
So they're like little evolutionary experiments, each one shaped by the unique conditions of their island.
Exactly. And their story highlights how important isolation can be in the evolution of unique species. But biogeography also tells us about the interconnectedness of life on a grand scale. Think about how continental drift, the movement of continents over millions of years, has shaped the distribution of species.
So evolution isn't just about adapting to a static environment. It's about adapting to a planet that's constantly moving and changing.
Exactly. And that constant change has created some of the most fascinating patterns we see in the natural world.
I'm starting to see the world in a whole new light, like this grand tapestry woven by billions of years of evolution. It's incredible.
It really is. And we've only just scratched the surface. We haven't even touched on the evolution of behavior, the role of chance in shaping life, or the incredible world of coevolution.
Coevolution, what's that all about?
Well, coevolution is like an intricate dance between two or more species.
A dance. Tell me more.
It happens when the evolution of one species influences the evolution of another.
So like they're evolving together.
In a way, yes. It's kind of like an arms race, but instead of weapons, it's adaptations.
I never thought of it that way. So what are some examples of coevolution?
Well, think about predators and their prey. As predators evolve to become faster and more cunning at catching their prey, the prey species evolve ways to avoid being caught.
Like camouflage or speed, or maybe even some kind of defense mechanism.
Exactly. It's a constant game of cat and mouse, with evolution setting the rules.
That makes sense. Are there other examples of coevolution?
Oh, absolutely. One of the coolest examples is the relationship between flowering plants and their pollinators, like bees and butterflies.
Wait, flowers and bees, they evolve together. How does that work?
So flowering plants need to be pollinated to reproduce.
Right, that's how they make new plants.
Exactly. So they've evolved all these amazing ways to attract pollinators, like bright colors, sweet nectar, and even special shapes that perfectly fit certain pollinators.
It's like each flower is putting on a show to attract the best pollinators.
Exactly. And those pollinators, like bees, have evolved alongside the flowers. They have adaptations to better reach the nectar and pollen inside the flowers.
So it's like a perfect partnership. each one helping the other to survive and thrive.
Precisely. And that partnership, that coevolution, has led to the incredible diversity of flowering plants and pollinators we see today. It's a beautiful example of how evolution can lead to these amazing, mutually beneficial relationships between different species.
Wow, that's remarkable. It's like a giant web of life with each species connected to and influencing the others.
It is. And those connections, those relationships, they're at the heart of evolution, shaping the tapestry of life on Earth.
This is blowing my mind. It's like evolution isn't just about competition and survival. It's about cooperation and connection.
Exactly. And those connections are what make studying evolution so fascinating. It's like piecing together a giant puzzle, but the puzzle pieces are constantly changing and interacting with each other. And that creates this endlessly fascinating and dynamic picture of life on Earth.
So we've got competition, cooperation, adaptation, chance. It seems like evolution has it all.
It really does. It's a never-ending story full of twists and turns, and we're all characters in this grand evolutionary saga.
And we're just beginning to understand the intricacies of it all.
Exactly. There's still so much we don't know, which is what makes it so fascinating.
I don't know about you, but I'm ready to dive even deeper.
Let's do it. There's so much more to explore.
Perfect. Because speaking of exploring, we briefly touched on how humans have become major players in this whole evolutionary drama.
We have, haven't we?
But it's not just about breeding dogs and fancy tomatoes anymore, right? Our impact goes way beyond that.
It does. Think about it. We've completely reshaped the planet. We've got sprawling cities, massive farmlands. We've altered landscapes, introduced new species. We've even changed the climate.
We have become a force of nature.
We have, and all of that has a ripple effect. It impacts the evolution of countless other organisms.
So we're not just shaping our own destiny, we're shaping the destiny of countless other species too.
We are. It's like we're these accidental evolutionary engineers influencing the direction of life on Earth.
It makes you wonder, are we up to the task?
It's a question we have to ask ourselves, because some of our impacts have had unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, take antibiotic resistance. We didn't set out to create superbugs, but our overuse of antibiotics created the perfect conditions for those resistant strains to thrive.
So we accidentally gave them an evolutionary edge.
We did, and now we're in this constant arms race with these microbes. They evolve, we develop new drugs, they evolve again. It's a vicious cycle.
It's a reminder that evolution is a powerful force, and we're not always in control.
Exactly. And it's not just about microbes either. Think about how habitat loss is forcing countless species to adapt to smaller, more fragmented environments.
It's like we're shrinking their world, and they have to figure out how to survive in these smaller spaces.
Exactly. And then there's climate change, which is probably the biggest challenge of all. It's altering the timing of seasons, impacting migration patterns, and even shifting the ranges of entire species.
So it's like we're changing the rules of the game, and not all species are equipped to adapt that quickly.
Exactly. We're changing the environment faster than some species can adapt, which can have devastating consequences.
So it's a wake-up call. We need to be more aware of our impacts, not just on our own species, but on the entire web of life.
Absolutely. Understanding evolution isn't just about looking at the past. It's about understanding where we are now and where we're going as a species. And it's about recognizing the profound responsibility we have to the rest of life on Earth.
I like that, understanding our place in this grand evolutionary story.
Because we're not separate from nature, we're a part of it, and our actions have consequences.
So true. Okay, let's dive back into some of the evolutionary concepts we've been discussing.
Sounds good to me. Where do you want to start?
Well, our sources talk a lot about fitness. And it's not always about being the strongest or the fastest, right? So what does it actually mean for an organism to be fit in an evolutionary sense?
That's a great question. And you're right, it's not about what we typically think of as fitness. In evolution, fitness is all about reproductive success.
So it's not about how long you live, but about how many offspring you produce that survive to have their own offspring.
Exactly. It's about passing on your genes to the next generation and the next and the next. Think of it this way. The more offspring an organism contributes to the gene pool, the higher its fitness.
So a cactus with those prickly spines and shallow roots that might not seem very fit to us, but if it's thriving in its desert environment and producing lots of offspring,
then it's very fit. It's all about being a good fit for your specific environment. A polar bear wouldn't last long in the desert, and a cactus wouldn't thrive in the Arctic.
so fitness is relative.
Exactly. And here's the key: that environment can change. What makes an organism fit today might not work so well tomorrow if the environment shifts.
So evolution is a moving target.
In a way, yes. which is why it's such a dynamic process.
That makes sense. But what about those traits that don't seem to help with survival at all? Like, we've talked about those flashy peacocks with their elaborate
Oh,
tails.
yeah. Yes, the peacocks.
They're beautiful, but doesn't that giant tail make them more vulnerable to predators?
It can, but that's where sexual selection comes in.
Right, because if you can't survive long enough to find a mate.
Exactly. You're not going to pass on your genes. So sexual selection favors traits that increase an organism's chances of attracting a mate and reproducing, even if those traits have some drawbacks.
So it's a trade-off.
Sometimes it is. A peacock's tail is basically saying, hey, I know this tail makes me a bit more noticeable, but look how strong and healthy I am to survive with this thing.
It's like they're showing off their genetic fitness.
Exactly. And it clearly works. Peahens love those tails. So it's a risky strategy, but it can pay off.
So there are different ways to win at the game of evolution.
Hmm.
But it all comes back to passing on those genes.
That's the name of the game. Survival of the fittest genes.
I love it. But how do scientists actually study all this? I mean, it's not like we can go back in time and watch evolution unfold.
Wouldn't that
but-
be amazing? While we don't have time machines, we do have some pretty cool tools at our disposal.
Like what?
Well, remember how we talked about the fossil record, comparative anatomy, and molecular biology?
Yeah. They're like clues from the past.
Exactly. They're like puzzle pieces that help us reconstruct the history of life on Earth.
So it's like detective work.
It is. Scientists are like detectives, piecing together evidence from the past to understand how life has changed over millions of years.
That's a pretty cool way to think about it. So what are some of the techniques these evolutionary detectives use?
One important one is phylogenetic analysis.
Phylogenetic analysis. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Right.
Basically, scientists use data on traits, things like anatomical features, DNA sequences, things like that. And they use that data to reconstruct the evolutionary relationships between different groups of organisms.
So it's like building a family tree, but instead of aunts and uncles, it's showing how different species are related to each other.
Exactly. And those trees can be incredibly detailed, showing not just who's related to whom, but also when those lineages branched off from each other.
Wow. So we can map out the evolution of life on Earth. That's incredible. What other tools are in the evolutionary detective's toolkit?
Another cool one is experimental evolution.
Experimental evolution. What is that?
It's basically what it sounds like. Scientists design experiments to study evolution as it happens.
Wait, you mean they can watch evolution in action?
They can. They often use organisms with short generation times like bacteria or fruit flies.
So they can observe lots of generations in a short amount of time.
Exactly. And because they can observe so many generations, they can actually track evolutionary changes as they happen in the lab.
That's amazing. But isn't evolution supposed to take millions of years?
It can. But these lab experiments allow scientists to create specific conditions that speed up the process. It's like fast forwarding through evolutionary time.
That's amazing. So it's not just about digging up fossils and looking at DNA anymore. Scientists are actively testing and studying the mechanisms of evolution.
Exactly. And that's leading to some incredible discoveries.
This is blowing my mind. I'm starting to see the world in a whole new light. But with all this talk about adaptation and survival of the fittest, it's easy to think of evolution as this linear progression, like a ladder leading to some perfect being. But our sources emphasize that's not how it works.
Not at all. There's no finish line in evolution. It's not about being the best or most advanced. It's about being well suited to your environment right now. And what's beneficial now might not be so great in a million years.
So a trait that's advantageous today might be a liability tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A great example is, again, our polar bear. Its thick fur coat is fantastic in the Arctic, but if the climate warms and that ice melts, that coat becomes a problem.
Oh no, poor polar bears.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that evolution is less like climbing a ladder and more like navigating a constantly shifting landscape.
That is a great way to put it. It's about rolling with the punches, adapting to whatever challenges the environment throws your way, because those challenges are always changing.
You got it. And it's that constant change that keeps things interesting.
So if evolution isn't about reaching some perfect state, what drives it? Why do species evolve in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, in a nutshell, is change. Environments are always in flux. Climate changes, geological events happen, even the actions of other organisms.
It's like a constantly shuffling deck of cards.
Exactly. And all those changes create these selective pressures that force life to adapt or die out.
So it's not necessarily about becoming better, it's about becoming different.
In a way, yes. Evolution favors those who can hack it in the ever-changing game of life.
Like evolution is a dance between organisms and their environments, each one shaping the other over time.
Exactly, and that dance has been going on for billions of years, creating all this incredible diversity of life we see on this planet. Pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is. It makes you appreciate that every organism on Earth, from the tiniest bacteria to the largest whale, is the result of billions of years of evolution. We're all part of this ancient lineage that stretches back to the very beginning.
We are. And the story's not over yet. Evolution is still happening. It's an ongoing process, and we're right in the middle of it.
So we're all part of this epic story of life, this constant dance of evolution. It's pretty awe-inspiring and also kind of mind-boggling. With these intricate processes happening over millions of years, how do scientists even begin to make sense of it all? How do you study something so vast and complex?
It's definitely a challenge, but scientists have come up with some pretty ingenious ways to study evolution.
Oh, like what?
One approach is to look at how populations change over time. Like, imagine tracking the beak size of those Galapagos finches over several generations.
So they're actually watching evolution unfold in real time.
Exactly. By observing those changes, scientists can figure out what's driving them. And now, with all the cool new technologies like genome sequencing,
Yeah?
they can track those evolutionary changes at the genetic level.
Whoa. So we're not just limited to what we can see with our eyes anymore.
Well,
We can actually see those tiny changes in DNA that are driving evolution.
we can. It's amazing. It's like we have a front row seat to the greatest show on Earth, and it's been running for billions of years.
That's a pretty awesome way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But with all this talk about adaptation and survival of the fittest, I think it's easy to think of evolution as this linear progression, like a ladder, like life is constantly evolving to become better and better, more and more perfect.
Right. A lot of people think that.
But our sources make it pretty clear that's not how it works at all.
Not at all. There's no finish line, no perfect being in evolution. It's all about being well suited to your environment at this moment in time.
So a trait that's great today might be a liability tomorrow if the environment changes.
Exactly. The environment is the ultimate judge, and it's always changing the rules of the game.
So evolution is more like a game of chance than a carefully planned strategy.
In a way, yes. There's an element of chance to it. It's not always about being the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time.
Wow. Okay, so if evolution isn't about reaching some perfect state, then what's the driving force behind it? Why do species evolve in the first place?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, if you really boil it down, is change. Environments are in constant flux. Climates change, landscapes change. Even the actions of other living organisms change the game.
So evolution is life's way of responding to a world that's always in motion.
You got it. It's this beautiful, intricate dance between life and the environment, each one shaping the other over time. And that dance has been going on for billions of years, resulting in all this incredible diversity of life that we see around us.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it, the dance of life. And it's a dance with billions of players all interacting and evolving together.
It really is. It's like an epic story with a cast of trillions.
But we're just one tiny part of this incredible story, aren't we?
We are. And the amazing thing is, the story's still being written.
That's a humbling thought, isn't it? To think that every organism on Earth, from the tiniest microbe to the biggest whale, is a product of this incredible process of evolution. And we're all connected.
Exactly. We're all connected by this ancient thread that stretches back to the very beginning of life on Earth.
I love that image, this thread connecting us all. It makes you want to go out and learn more about all these incredible creatures we share the planet with, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you realize that every species has a story to tell, a story shaped by millions of years of evolution.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into evolution, haven't we?
We have. From Darwin's groundbreaking work to the latest genetic discoveries, it's been quite a journey.
It has, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to discover. That's the beauty of science, isn't it? It's a never-ending quest for knowledge and understanding.
Absolutely. So any final thoughts to leave our listeners with as they continue their own explorations of the natural world?
Here's one to ponder. Evolution isn't just something that happened in the distant past. It's happening right now, all around us.
It's happening right under our noses.
It is. Every time a new virus emerges, every time a plant adapts to a changing climate, that's evolution in action. So keep your eyes open, your mind curious, because there are incredible wonders to discover all around us, and they all have a story to tell.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining me on this amazing adventure into the world of evolution. It's been a wild ride. Until next time, keep exploring.